Your little shop is just a hobby," my husband said, lifting his wine glass as if he were offering a toast instead of a dismissal. The private dining room overlooking Elliott Bay glowed in soft gold light, the city shimmering behind him like it belonged to his future. "It keeps her busy," he added, smiling at the investors seated around the long walnut table. "It's nothing compared to a $2 billion merger." The laughter wasn't loud. That almost made it worse. It was polite, controlled, the kind of laughter powerful people use when they're not sure whether something is funny, but they understand hierarchy. I felt every pair of eyes slide toward me and then away just as quickly. One of the junior partners adjusted his cufflinks. The CFO studied his wine. No one spoke up. I didn't react. I didn't defend myself. I didn't force a smile. I looked at Grant for a long moment, long enough for the air to tighten. Then I set my napkin on the table and stood. "That merger," I said evenly, "is now my call." A fork hit porcelain somewhere to my left. The board chair blinked. Grant's smile didn't fade immediately. It flickered first, as if he were waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. They thought I was embarrassed. They had no idea I was about to change everything. I'm Natalie Mercer. I was 43 that night, founder of a home fragrance company that started in our garage and now shipped to customers in 27 states. 6 years earlier, I had traded late nights at a corporate law firm for wax samples, branding decks, and wholesale negotiations. People like to call it brave. Grant liked to call it quaint. My little shop paid our mortgage the first year he moved between firms. It covered health insurance when his startup equity was still theoretical. It funded the renovation of that glass-walled dining room he loved to host in. But success, when it grows quietly, is easy to underestimate. Grant was 46, senior executive architect of a $2 billion merger between his cloud infrastructure company and a rising cybersecurity firm. Financial media had started calling it transformative. His face had appeared in 2 industry magazines that spring. The deal wasn't just business to him. It was identity. In the past 2 years, something in our marriage had shifted. At charity galas, he introduced me as the creative one. At investor retreats, he described my company as a passion project. The comments were always delivered with a smile, always framed as affection. I told myself it was harmless. But that night, in front of the people who controlled capital and careers, it felt deliberate. After I spoke, the board chair cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, glancing between us. "What do you mean by that?" "Natalie?" Grant laughed too quickly. "She's joking," he said. "We both know who's steering this ship." I held his gaze. "Actually," I replied, "we don't." The CFO's eyes lifted then, meeting mine for a split second before sliding away again. That was the first crack. He knew something. Or at least, he knew I wasn't bluffing. 3 years earlier, before I stepped fully into building my small business, I had still been practicing corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, complex structures, special purpose entities designed to protect executive leadership from conflict exposure. When Grant began quietly assembling the framework for this acquisition, he asked me to review early drafts. "It'll be cleaner if you handle the structure," he'd said. "Less outside visibility." I had agreed. I trusted him. Back then, the deal was just ambition on paper, not a headline. Standing in that dining room, with investors watching and the skyline behind us, I remembered a specific clause buried deep in the holding company agreement. A clause I insisted on when drafting governance thresholds. A clause Grant once teased me about for being overly cautious. He thought I'd forgotten it. He thought stepping away from corporate law meant relinquishing leverage. The board chair tried again. "Natalie," he said gently, "are you suggesting you have formal authority over the merger closing?" Grant's jaw tightened. "She doesn't," he said firmly. "Let's not derail the evening." Linda Carver, one of the independent directors, leaned back slightly in her chair. She hadn't laughed earlier. Now she watched me with something like recognition. "I'm suggesting," I said calmly, that governance is more layered than people assume. Silence returned. Heavier this time. The dinner resumed eventually, but the tone had shifted. Conversations turned cautious. Investors began asking technical questions about disclosure timing and regulatory approvals. Grant answered them, but I could hear the edge in his voice now. The easy confidence was gone. When dessert plates were cleared, guests began offering polite goodbyes. A few shook my hand with new curiosity. The CFO lingered half a second too long before leaving, as if he wanted to say something and thought better of it. In the car ride home, the city lights flickering across the windshield, Grant finally broke. "What was that?" he demanded. "You blindsided me." "I corrected you," I said. "You embarrassed me in front of the board." "You did that first." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You don't understand the complexity of this deal." I turned toward him slowly. "I understand it better than you think." He scoffed, dismissing me with a shake of his head, as if I were being dramatic, as if this were about wounded pride. But this wasn't about pride. It was about structure, about signatures, about equity most people at that table didn't realize still existed. When we pulled into our driveway, the house lights glowing against the damp Seattle night, Grant walked inside ahead of me without another word. I stayed in the car for a moment longer, listening to the ticking engine cool. They thought the story was about a husband mocking his wife's small business. They thought the humiliation was the conflict. It wasn't. The conflict was hidden in documents no one had revisited in years. And by morning, I was going to... Grant was already dressed when I walked into the kitchen the next morning, knotting his tie with sharp, efficient movements like he was preparing for battle. He didn't look at me. "What you said last night," he began, reaching for his coffee, "was unnecessary." The word hung there. Unnecessary. I poured my own cup slowly. "Calling my company a hobby in front of your board was unnecessary." He exhaled through his nose. "It was a joke." "Natalie." Everyone understood that. They laughed. I said, "That's not the same thing." He finally faced me. "You created confusion. Investors are already nervous about closing timelines. We don't need theatrics." The irony almost made me smile. "You think I don't understand timelines?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. "You stepped away from this world." "No, I built another one." He glanced at his watch. "I have a strategy session in 30 minutes. We'll talk tonight. And please don't escalate this. You don't understand the complexity of this deal." There it was again. He grabbed his briefcase and left without waiting for a response. The door shut with controlled force. Not a slam. Grant rarely slammed doors. He preferred pressure that built invisibly. I stood alone in the kitchen, watching the gray Seattle morning filter through the glass. He thought I didn't understand the complexity. 3 years earlier, before I shifted fully into running my small business, complexity had been my specialty. I drove downtown instead of heading to my studio warehouse. The familiar skyline of financial offices and law firms rose ahead of me, and for a moment it felt like muscle memory returning to my body, before candles and wholesale orders. I was a corporate attorney. Mergers and acquisitions, governance structures, special purpose entities designed to protect leadership from exposure and preserve strategic control. I'd spent nearly a decade drafting agreements that determined who truly held power when the press releases were done. When Grant first began quietly assembling the acquisition framework that would become his $2 billion merger, he asked for my help. "It'll be cleaner if you structure the holding vehicle," he had said at the time. "Less outside scrutiny, fewer leaks." We were still aligned then, or at least I believed we were. I parked in a discreet co-working legal suite I maintained for occasional consulting work. I hadn't used the space in months. The receptionist recognized me and smiled politely, unaware that my marriage might be unraveling behind that calm exterior. Inside a small conference room, I opened my laptop and logged into encrypted cloud storage I hadn't accessed since the merger framework was finalized. The original operating agreement appeared on my screen. There it was. The holding entity I created, the layered structure, the trust allocation, The equity thresholds. I had insisted on retaining a minority stake through a family trust vehicle, quiet, compliant, entirely legal. Not because I expected conflict, but because governance without balance is fragile. My name sat exactly where I remembered it. Controlling approval required for final asset consolidation. I scrolled further. 6 months earlier, an amendment had been filed. I leaned forward. The amendment attempted to adjust voting thresholds tied to trust equity. Dilution language. Subtle. Technical. Buried under procedural updates. My chest tightened. Not with panic, but with recognition. He had tried to reduce my leverage. I opened the filing metadata. It had been submitted through internal counsel. I was copied on the bulk corporate consent email. I remembered signing a packet that month. Routine compliance certifications bundled together. Had the amendment been embedded in that stack? I checked the digital timestamp. Yes. My signature authorization had applied automatically through a consolidated approval format. I sat back slowly. He hadn't forged anything. He hadn't needed to. He had relied on trust and volume. My phone buzzed on the table. Grant. I let it ring once before answering. What are you doing? He asked without greeting. Reviewing documents, I replied. A pause. You don't need to dig into this, he said carefully. The amendment was procedural. It altered voting thresholds tied to trust equity. Silence. It streamlined governance. He corrected. It diluted my approval leverage. That was never your lane, he said sharply. You said you didn't want to be involved. I remembered that conversation. I had said I didn't want public exposure. I had not said I was surrendering structural authority. You should have discussed it with me directly, I said. You're overreacting. I closed my eyes briefly. Am I? Another silence. Then his tone shifted. Softer but edged. This merger is bigger than us. If you push back publicly, you risk destabilizing everything. Everything. Employees. Investors. Reputation. And our home. I'm not pushing publicly. I said, I'm reviewing governance. He exhaled. Don't do anything impulsive. I almost laughed. Impulsive. If he understood me at all, he would know I don't move impulsively. After the call ended, I opened a new window and searched recent disclosure filings tied to the acquisition target. There it was, an unresolved federal data security inquiry referenced in supplemental materials. Not highlighted in the investor deck. Not emphasized in press statements. Buried. I stared at the page, tracing the language carefully. Disclosure existed, but placement mattered. Risk, when minimized in presentation, becomes liability. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in years. Rebecca Hall. Independent counsel. No ties to Grant's firm. She answered on the second ring. Natalie. This is unexpected. I need a confidential review, I said. Governance structure. Fiduciary exposure. Possible disclosure insufficiencies. There was a pause, then a measured reply. How urgent. Very. We scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. As I packed my laptop, I glanced once more at the clause I had written 3 years earlier. The protective language that required my signature before final consolidation. I had drafted it to shield us both. He had assumed it was symbolic. Driving back toward the waterfront, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not panic. Clarity. He thought I walked away from power when I built my small business. He forgot I never signed it away. The formal notice went out at 9:14 on Wednesday morning. I was standing in the middle of my warehouse studio when Rebecca called to confirm it had been delivered to the board secretary and copied to internal counsel. Around me, the scent of bergamot and cedar hung in the air while my team packed wholesale orders for a boutique hotel chain in Denver. Your equity review rights have been formally asserted, she said. They're obligated to respond. How long before it reaches Grant? I asked. A pause. If it hasn't already, it will within minutes. I thanked her and ended the call just as my phone vibrated with an incoming email. Not from Grant. From the board secretary. Subject line: Acknowledgement of stakeholder review request. He hadn't written only to me. He had copied the entire executive team. And Grant. The war was no longer theoretical. By the time I got home that evening, Grant was waiting in the living room. Jacket off. Sleeves rolled up. Tension radiating off him in sharp, controlled waves. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked before I'd even set down my bag. "I'm exercising my rights," I said calmly. "You blindsided the board. I notified them through proper channels. You're creating instability during final closing," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what a delay does to investor confidence?" "Yes," I said. "It protects them from undisclosed exposure." His eyes hardened. "There is no undisclosed exposure. There's an ongoing federal inquiry tied to the target's data security practices. That's disclosed in supplemental materials." "Buried," I corrected. He paced once across the room. "You don't understand how these things are presented. It's strategic positioning. Strategic omission," I said quietly, "becomes fiduciary risk." He stopped walking. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" he demanded. "That the amendment attempting to dilute trust voting thresholds was filed without independent director quorum." The words landed between us like a dropped glass. "That's procedural," he said. "It required unanimous independent director consent under the original operating agreement. You're interpreting it aggressively." "I drafted it." Silence. For the first time since the dinner, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "You're risking everything," he said more quietly now. "This merger is transformative." "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. The next morning I met Rebecca in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Seattle. She had already printed portions of the merger disclosure documents and laid them across the table in neat stacks. "We start with advisory compensation," she said. I nodded. We traced the paper trail carefully. Consulting contracts, advisory retainers, layered entities structured to obscure direct executive benefit while remaining technically compliant. Then we found it. A shell entity tied to a venture advisory group. Minority interest. But meaningful. Grant's name didn't appear directly, but compensation flowed through an indirect structure. "Was this disclosed to the full board?" Rebecca asked. "It wasn't disclosed to me," I replied. "That's not the same thing." "No," I said. "It's worse. If independent directors had not been fully informed of indirect compensation linked to the acquisition target, governance exposure expanded dramatically." Rebecca leaned back. "This isn't criminal." "But if it wasn't clearly disclosed, it's a problem." My phone buzzed against the polished table. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a text appeared from the same number. "Stop digging into the advisory contracts." My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. I slid the phone across the table toward Rebecca. She read it once, then looked up at me. "Do you recognize the number?" "No." "Save it. Don't respond." I nodded. The threat wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. Controlled. Corporate. Someone was watching the paper trail. That afternoon, I received confirmation that an emergency governance session would be scheduled with independent directors present. My request for review had triggered formal procedural escalation. Grant called as I was pulling into my driveway. "You've made your point," he said without greeting. "Withdraw the request." "There's nothing to withdraw. You're forcing a board-level review during final stage negotiations. Because there are issues. There are optics," he corrected sharply. "You're reacting emotionally. I'm reacting structurally." A long silence stretched between us. "You could have come to me," he said finally. "I did." "You could have trusted me." "I did," I answered. That was the part he didn't understand. This wasn't revenge born from humiliation at a dinner table. That moment had simply exposed something already fractured. The issue was trust inside documentation. Later that evening, as I reviewed supplemental filings again, I noticed something else. Bridge financing. Short-term capital secured to stabilize cash flow until closing. Backed by executive guarantees. My stomach tightened. I opened the attachment and read carefully. Collateral references were vague, but one line caught my eye. Shared real estate assets leveraged as contingent security. Our home. I stared at the page. Had he used our property to secure bridge exposure tied to the merger timeline? The thought settled heavy in my chest. This was no longer only about disclosure nuance. It was personal risk layered inside corporate ambition. I closed my laptop slowly. The emergency board session was scheduled for Friday in San Francisco. Grant hadn't told me. They had sent the notice directly to me as equity stakeholder. The structure I built was now forcing accountability. I stepped out onto the back patio. The air cool and damp against my skin. The city skyline glowed faintly across the water. Somewhere inside the house, Grant was on the phone. His voice low. Controlled. He still believed this was manageable. He still believed I would pull back. But the paper trail had already begun to unravel something larger than his confidence. The merger wasn't collapsing. It was being examined. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt something steady beneath the tension. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Authority. The boardroom in San Francisco was colder than I expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, muted by a thin layer of coastal fog. The long conference table gleamed under recessed lighting, polished and impersonal. When I walked in, conversations lowered but did not stop. Eyes tracked me, some curious, some guarded. I wasn't there as Grant's wife. I was there as an equity stakeholder. The general counsel stood near the screen at the front of the room, shuffling papers. He nodded at me but didn't extend his hand. Grant was already seated at the head of the table, posture straight, expression composed in the way he used when cameras were present. There were no cameras today. Just directors. Investors dialed in remotely. Outside compliance counsel seated near the corner. The board chair cleared his throat. We're convened under special governance review requested by stakeholder Natalie Mercer. The use of my full name felt deliberate. Grant's jaw tightened slightly. We're here, the chair continued, to review concerns related to disclosure practices and structural amendments tied to the merger. The $2 billion merger. The words still sounded grand. Historic. But today they felt fragile. Grant leaned forward. Before we proceed, he said smoothly, I want to emphasize that all disclosures have complied with regulatory requirements. This review is procedural. Procedural. I folded my hands calmly on the table. The amendment adjusting trust voting thresholds required unanimous independent director consent under the original operating agreement. The general counsel shifted in his seat. That amendment, Grant said quickly, streamlined governance to prevent closing delays. It altered equity influence, I replied. Without full independent quorum. Silence rippled across the table. Linda Carver, seated 3 chairs down from Grant, lifted her gaze. Grant, she said evenly, were independent directors formally notified of the voting threshold implications? A fraction of a pause. The amendment package was circulated. He answered, That's not what I asked, she replied. The tension in the room sharpened. Outside counsel adjusted his glasses. For clarity, he said. Documentation indicates that while notice was distributed, explicit discussion of trust dilution impact was not separately recorded in meeting minutes. There it was. Not illegal. Not dramatic. But incomplete? Grant's voice cooled. This is being framed as something it isn't. No one is framing anything, I said. We're reviewing fiduciary exposure. The CFO cleared his throat and moved to the presentation screen. Slides flickered to life, valuation projections, synergy targets, integration timelines. These numbers assume closing within 30 days, he said. Any delay introduces volatility. I leaned forward slightly. Do those projections account for the ongoing federal data security inquiry tied to the target company? The CFO hesitated. That matter is referenced in supplemental disclosure. Referenced, I repeated. Not emphasized? An institutional investor's voice crackled through the speakerphone. What's the potential exposure if litigation escalates post-closing? The room stilled. Outside counsel answered carefully. Material exposure cannot be fully quantified at this stage. Grant's composure thinned. Every major merger carries some degree of risk, he said. We can't paralyze execution over theoretical scenarios. It's not theoretical if it's under federal review, I replied. The board chair leaned back slowly. Let's address advisory compensation concerns, he said. A different slide appeared. Shell entities. Consulting structures. Grant's expression hardened. There is no impropriety, he said. Compensation pathways are compliant. Were they fully disclosed to independent directors? Linda asked again. Another silence. The investor on the line spoke up. If there are indirect compensation arrangements tied to the acquisition target that were not clearly disclosed, that changes our risk profile. The word risk hung in the air like static. I felt no satisfaction. Only gravity. The board chair turned to me. Ms. Mercer. Under the holding agreement, final asset consolidation requires your authorization. Is that correct? Yes, I said. Grant's head snapped slightly in my direction. The general counsel nodded reluctantly. That is correct under the original governance framework. And the attempted amendment? Linda added. Did not secure unanimous independent consent. A quiet shift passed across the table. Chairs adjusted. Pens stilled. The board chair exhaled. We have two issues. Disclosure sufficiency and governance amendment irregularity. He looked toward the independent directors. I proposed temporary delay of closing pending internal review. Grant leaned forward sharply. A delay at this stage signals weakness to the market. It signals accountability, Linda said. The speakerphone crackled again. From an investor standpoint, the voice said, proceeding without clarity poses greater reputational damage than a controlled delay. Reputational damage. Grant's shoulders tightened. A vote was called. Independent directors raised their hands first. One by one. The motion carried. The $2 billion merger was placed under conditional hold pending governance review. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't scandal. It was scrutiny. Grant sat back slowly. The polished certainty he'd worn for months finally cracking. This is unnecessary, he said quietly. No, I replied just as quietly. It's responsible. The meeting adjourned in controlled disorder. Phones lit up. Assistants moved quickly. Outside counsel gathered documents with efficient urgency. By the time I stepped outside the building, financial alerts were already lighting up my screen. Merger closing delayed pending governance review. Stock dipped in after hours trading. Grant exited the building several minutes later, surrounded by two senior executives. He did not look at me. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing more of the skyline. He thought the dinner humiliation was power. He thought headlines were power. But power wasn't volume. It was structure. And structure, once questioned, doesn't go back to being invisible. The headlines hit before sunrise. Governance concerns stall $2 billion merger. Executive leadership under review. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as notification after notification lit up my phone on the nightstand. Analysts were speculating. Commentators were dissecting language from the board's statement. Financial networks were replaying clips of Grant from earlier press interviews. Confident and assured, juxtaposed with the new narrative of structural scrutiny. In the warehouse later that morning, nothing felt unstable. My team moved between packing tables with quiet efficiency. Orders were labeled. Wholesale invoices printed. One of our managers asked if I'd approved the final design for a holiday collaboration candle. Yes, I said. Go ahead. The rhythm of my small business steadied me. It had always been real, tangible, transparent. My phone buzzed again. A business journalist. She wanted comment, not from Grant. But from me, I declined politely. I wasn't interested in spectacle. By the time I returned home that evening, Grant was waiting in the living room. Television muted but financial news ticker crawling across the bottom of the screen. You've destabilized the deal, he said immediately. I've protected it, I replied. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he rarely made. Stock dipped 4% after hours, and it will recover if governance holds. You think investors like uncertainty? I think they like lawsuits less. He stared at me. You're enjoying this. No, I said quietly. I'm correcting it. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. You've always had to prove something. That landed harder than he probably intended. Is that what you think? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward his office, then stopped halfway. There's something else, he said, not turning around. I waited. Bridge financing was secured to stabilize short-term liquidity before closing. I saw the filings. I said, then you understand the exposure. Do I? He faced me slowly. Executive guarantees were required. Standard practice. Whose guarantees? He hesitated. Grant. I said, our primary residence was listed as contingent collateral. He said quickly, as if speed would soften it. It's temporary. It disappears at closing. The room felt suddenly smaller. You leveraged our home? I said. It's protected under normal conditions. You didn't discuss it with me. You were already opposing the deal. He shot back. I couldn't risk delay over a conversation. I felt something inside me go very still. I was still your wife, I said. And I'm still your husband, he snapped. Trying to protect our future. By risking our house. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand the scale of what's at stake. I understand exactly what's at stake. I said, you've tied our personal assets to a merger currently under review. He looked away first. Later that night, after he retreated to his office, I opened the financing attachment again. The language was precise but vague enough to blur exposure. Shared real estate assets subject to contingent executive guarantee obligations. I checked the consent authorization file. There it was. My digital signature embedded in a bulk compliance approval packet from months earlier. Bundled. Routine. Weaponized through assumption. He hadn't forged anything. He had relied on trust and volume. I closed my laptop and called Rebecca. We need to discuss personal asset protection, I said when she answered. She didn't sound surprised. I was expecting that. The next afternoon, we met in her office. Legal separation. Asset freeze options. Protective filings to shield my business equity from executive liability exposure. If the merger collapses under regulatory pressure, she said, creditors will move fast. And the guarantee, if triggered, it could complicate shared asset claims. I nodded slowly. So we file, I said. Quietly, she agreed. That evening, as rain streaked the windows, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt different now, not home, but collateral. I thought about the early years of our marriage. The tiny apartment in San Francisco. The nights we split takeout on the floor while he drafted pitch decks and I reviewed merger contracts. Back then, ambition had felt shared. My small business had begun as an experiment. Then it became income. Then it became stability. He called it decorative. But it had funded more than candles. It had funded independence. I opened my laptop again. Legal separation paperwork appeared on the screen. Straightforward. Clinical. Protective. This wasn't revenge. This was boundary. My finger hovered over the trackpad for only a moment before I clicked submit. In the next room, I heard Grant's phone buzz. A door opened. Footsteps crossed the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, face pale in a way I hadn't seen before. You filed? He asked quietly. Yes. Are you really doing this? I held his gaze. You already did, I said. He stared at me, something between anger and disbelief flickering behind his eyes. The merger was under review. Now our marriage was too, and for the first time in months, I felt no uncertainty about the direction forward. Only clarity. By the end of the second week, the financial press had shifted from speculation to scrutiny. Leadership restructuring considered a mid-governance review. The phrase appeared in 3 separate outlets before noon. My phone vibrated steadily on my desk while I reviewed wholesale forecasts for the next quarter. The contrast between steady product margins and volatile stock movement felt almost surreal. An email from the board secretary arrived just after 11. Independent Review Committee, attendance required. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Closed session. Independent directors and outside compliance counsel only. Grant's name was not listed among required attendees. I sat back in my chair, reading the message twice. The structure was beginning to respond to pressure. The next day, I entered a smaller conference room than the previous board session. No skyline views. No full executive presence. Just 3 independent directors. Rebecca, outside compliance counsel, and me. Grant arrived last. He didn't sit at the head of the table this time. He took a seat along the side. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. Outside counsel began outlining findings from the initial review. Disclosure documentation technically referenced advisory compensation relationships, he said. But the presentation did not clearly isolate indirect executive benefit exposure. Linda Carver folded her hands. Was the board made explicitly aware of indirect compensation pathways tied to the acquisition target? Grant answered carefully. The relationships were not concealed. They were structured. That's not the question, Linda replied. The compliance attorney cleared his throat. From a fiduciary standpoint, failure to isolate and emphasize potential conflict pathways increases regulatory risk. The word regulatory seemed to echo longer than the others. And the amendment? Another director asked. Outside counsel responded. Amendment documentation did not secure explicit independent director approval, specific to voting threshold alteration. While circulated, consent specificity is questionable. Grant leaned forward. This is being interpreted aggressively. It's being interpreted cautiously, I said. He didn't look at me. The conversation shifted to bridge financing exposure. Executive guarantees. Contingent asset collateral. Was the board aware that shared real estate assets were listed under executive guarantee obligations? Linda asked. Grant hesitated again. That was operational, he said finally. Temporary. Operational exposure still requires clarity. The director responded. I felt no triumph. Only weight. The review session adjourned after nearly 2 hours. Grant was asked to step outside while the independent directors remained. The door closed behind him. The atmosphere changed immediately. We need to discuss leadership continuity, Linda said quietly. One of the other directors nodded. Market confidence requires accountability. He's capable. Another added, but optics are deteriorating. They turned toward me. You hold final approval authority, Linda said. We need stability. I want the merger to succeed, I replied, but not under unresolved exposure. There was a pause. We're considering temporary removal of Grant from active merger oversight pending completion of compliance review, Linda said. The air seemed to compress. Will that trigger investor panic? One director asked. Not if framed as governance reinforcement. Another responded. A speakerphone on the table lit up. A major institutional investor had joined. Our position is straightforward, the voice said. Proceed with restructuring and transparency. And we maintain support. Ignore governance concerns. And we reconsider. The decision was no longer abstract. A vote was called. Temporary administrative leave from merger leadership. Independent oversight subcommittee formation. The motion carried. Grant was asked to return to the room. When he heard the decision, his face didn't explode with anger. It tightened. Controlled. Calculating. You're overcorrecting, he said. We're stabilizing, Linda answered. His eyes moved to me then. You did this, he said quietly. No, I replied. The structure did. Later that afternoon. My phone rang. Grant. I never thought you'd actually assert authority publicly, he said without greeting. You never thought I'd need to? I answered. This will follow me, he said. Reputation doesn't reset easily. Neither does trust, I said. There was a long silence. I assumed, he began, then stopped. Assumed what? I asked. That you'd keep things private, he admitted. Private. Invisible. Contained. You confused silence with agreement, I said. That evening, the board requested I temporarily chair the oversight subcommittee tied to compliance reform. Not as a symbolic gesture, as structural necessity. I agreed on conditions. Full transparency reporting. Independent audit of advisory contracts. Immediate removal of any personal asset exposure tied to executive guarantees. The General Counsel confirmed adjustments would be drafted. Before official announcements were released, financial news alerts began circulating again. Leadership restructuring underway, amid merger review. Grant's role reframed as advisory pending audit completion. The narrative was shifting. Not scandal. Correction. I sat in my warehouse office that night. Retail expansion proposal open on one side of my desk. Compliance audit framework on the other. My small business hummed quietly around me. Pallets stacked neatly. Orders scheduled. No volatility ticker crawling across the bottom of a screen. He had believed control meant being the face of the merger. He had believed headlines equaled authority. But control wasn't visibility. It was the signature at the bottom of the page. And that signature still belonged to me. The conference room at Dalton and Pierce smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. 2 stacks of documents sat in front of me. On the left, the merger restructuring agreement. On the right, the marital settlement proposal. 2 tables. 2 futures. Grant stood by the window overlooking downtown Seattle, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared but no longer rigid. Weeks earlier he had commanded rooms with effortless certainty. Now his posture carried calculation. Before they come in, he said without turning around. We should talk. I folded my hands on the table. We are talking? He faced me slowly. You didn't have to escalate this publicly. I raised concerns privately, I replied. You went to the board. After you filed an amendment diluting my voting threshold without direct discussion. That amendment was procedural. So was the bridge financing guarantee? I asked. His jaw tightened. It was temporary, he said. You used our home as contingent collateral. It would have disappeared at closing. If closing had happened without review. Silence stretched between us. You're framing me as reckless, he said finally. I'm framing you as overconfident. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. This merger is transformative. It changes the company's trajectory for a decade. And governance changes protect it for longer, I said. He stepped closer to the table. You could have trusted me. I did, I answered. The door opened. Attorneys entered, measured and composed. Chairs were pulled back. Folders opened. The language shifted from emotional to clinical. Rebecca began outlining the restructuring framework. Independent compliance oversight will be permanently embedded, she said. Advisory compensation disclosures will be clarified in revised filings. Executive authority consolidation will require unanimous independent director consent. Grant's attorney nodded slowly. Grant is willing to accept limited operational capacity pending completion of audit review. Not sole architect. Not unilateral control. An institutional investor joined via secure line to confirm conditional support. Our continued backing, the voice stated, is contingent upon governance reforms remaining intact. Grant's expression flickered at that. He had once believed investor loyalty followed charisma. Now it followed structure. Final authorization remains subject to Ms. Mercer's approval under the original holding agreement, the General Counsel said carefully. All eyes shifted to me. I didn't speak yet. Instead, Rebecca slid the second stack of papers toward the center of the table. On the marital side, she said, we propose full separation of business interests. Ms. Mercer retains sole ownership of her company and associated intellectual property. Shared liabilities tied to executive guarantees are removed from her exposure. Grant's attorney adjusted his glasses. Grant will not contest business equity. That's not generosity, Rebecca replied evenly. It's clarity. The discussion moved to property. Primary residence equity division. Retirement accounts. Investment portfolios. There was no shouting. No slammed fists. Just numbers and percentages and signatures waiting to be placed. At one point, Grant leaned back and looked at me directly. You're dismantling 15 years? He said quietly. I'm restructuring it, I replied. His attorney cleared his throat. Prolonged litigation would increase reputational risk for both parties. Reputational risk. That phrase had followed us through every room for weeks. Grant looked down at the settlement terms again. You've always been strategic, he said, almost to himself. I've always been prepared, I corrected. Silence settled. The merger agreement was finalized first. Revised governance language. Compliance audit confirmation. Advisory disclosures clarified. Asset collateral exposure removed from personal property. The document was placed in front of me. This is the final authorization. The general counsel said. Grant watched my hands. 3 years earlier, I had drafted the framework that made this moment possible. I had inserted protective clauses believing they would never be tested. He had assumed they were decorative. Do you intend to proceed? Linda asked gently. Yes, I said. I signed. The pen moved smoothly across the paper. The $2 billion merger would proceed, but not under unilateral control. Then the marital settlement agreement was placed before me. The room felt quieter somehow. Grant didn't look at the paper. He looked at me. I never thought you'd take control of something this big, he said. I held his gaze. You confused visibility with power, I replied. I signed again. Within minutes, phones around the table began to vibrate. Merger back on track under revised leadership structure. Stock stabilizes following governance reforms. Grant's face appeared in a notification preview, framed beneath a headline that no longer positioned him as sole architect. He stood as the meeting adjourned. For a moment, neither of us moved. This didn't have to end like this, he said quietly. It didn't, I agreed. He gave a small nod. Not defeat. Not apology. Recognition. I left the law firm alone. The air outside was crisp, sharp against my skin. Traffic moved steadily along the street below, indifferent to corporate drama or personal collapse. There were no cameras, no applause, just paperwork completed and structures reset. He had thought my small business was a hobby. He had thought the dinner laughter defined hierarchy. But power wasn't who held the microphone. It was who held the signature. The merger would move forward. So would I. 1 year later, the warehouse smelled like cedar wood and orange peel instead of tension. Morning light poured through the high windows of our expanded space just outside Seattle, catching on rows of neatly labeled boxes ready to ship to 2 national retailers. Forklifts hummed softly. My operations manager was reviewing inventory levels with calm precision. There were no news tickers scrolling across the bottom of a screen. No analysts dissecting my decisions. Just product, team, growth. On the wall of my office, framed in simple black wood, hung a printed copy of the headline from the day the merger officially closed under revised governance. Merger completed following structural reforms. I didn't frame it as a trophy. I framed it as a reminder. The $2 billion merger survived. It closed 3 months after restructuring. Independent compliance oversight became permanent. Advisory disclosures were clarified. Executive authority was redistributed. The company stabilized. Stock recovered. And the narrative shifted from controversy to corporate maturity. Grant returned in a limited operational advisory capacity 6 months later. Not as the sole architect. Not as the face of unchecked ambition. But as one executive among several, accountable to structure instead of ego. I watched that transition from a distance. Not with bitterness. With clarity. My small business expanded faster than I anticipated. A regional retailer in California picked up our fall line. A boutique hotel chain signed a long-term fragrance contract. Revenue doubled year over year. Not because of scandal or publicity, but because the foundation was solid, For the first time in years, I wasn't splitting my attention between defending dignity and building something meaningful. The divorce finalized quietly. No courtroom drama. No tabloid speculation. Assets divided cleanly. My company remained fully mine. Our former home was sold. Equity distributed without litigation. Financial protection had replaced financial exposure. I moved into a smaller house closer to the water. Less glass. More privacy. One afternoon, months after everything settled, I was invited to sit on a panel at a governance and corporate ethics conference. The invitation didn't refer to me as someone's spouse. It listed my name, my background in corporate law, and my experience navigating structural authority. On stage, under neutral lighting, a moderator asked me what triggered my decision to assert control. I didn't mention the dinner. I didn't mention the laughter. I said, "Governance exists for moments when trust is tested." That was the truth. The humiliation that night hadn't created my strength. It had revealed it. A few weeks after the conference, I saw Grant again at a shareholder reception. The room was filled with quiet networking conversations and polite applause for quarterly performance updates. He approached me with measured calm. "You look well," he said. "I am?" I replied. He nodded once. "I didn't realize how much you were holding up." It wasn't an apology, but it was awareness. I wasn't holding it up, I said gently. I was holding it together. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he stepped away to speak with another executive. I didn't feel anger watching him go, just distance. He had mistaken patience for weakness. He had mistaken privacy for lack of power. He had mistaken my small business for something decorative. What he failed to understand was that quiet work builds leverage. Preparation builds authority. And dignity, once defended, does not need to shout. Back in my office now, I sometimes think about that night at the waterfront restaurant. The polite laughter. The soft clink of a fork against porcelain when I stood up. I don't replay it with humiliation anymore. I replay it with recognition. That was the moment I stopped absorbing dismissal and started enforcing structure. Revenge, at least the kind that lasts, isn't loud. It isn't destructive. It doesn't burn everything down. It recalibrates the foundation. My small business was never little. It was freedom. It was insulation. It was the reason I could walk into a boardroom and delay a $2 billion merger without fear of losing myself. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't raising your voice. It's knowing exactly when to sign your name. If you've ever been underestimated in your marriage, in your business, or even at your own family table, I hope this story reminded you of something important. Quiet does not mean powerless. Preparation is not passivity. And patience, when paired with strategy, can shift entire rooms. If this resonated with you, I'd love to know in the comments, have you ever been dismissed as just something, just a hobby, just support, just the background? And what changed when you decided to step forward? Stay with me for more stories like this, stories about dignity, hidden power, and the moment the tables turn quietly but completely. Sometimes justice doesn't explode. Sometimes it signs its name and walks out calmly. And sometimes that's more than enough.